guys, welcome back to the Homespun Hive. I'm Shelby, and today I want to share with you a little bit about fermenting your chicken feed. This was something that I kind of stumbled upon too when we first got our chicks, and I was researching just like natural care for chicks. What kind of things could I naturally do to help boost our chicks' immune systems, make sure that they are really digesting their food, and just keep them more healthy overall. And that's how I found that you can ferment your chick's feed. It was really cool to me. So I just wanted to share with you guys some of that I found. I'm gonna go over the two main methods that I saw most people talk about. The first one is called back slopping, and then the second one is more of a staggered approach. So before we talk about what the methods for fermenting your chicken feed are, I'm going to share why you would even want to consider fermenting your chicken feed. The biggest one that I saw was that it could actually potentially save you some money. And the reason why that is because once your chicken feed is fermented, your little chicken's bodies are actually able to use that food better in their bodies. They're able to break it down and get more nutrients from it, and so in turn they then need to eat less. But when you first start feeding your chickens fermented feed, especially if you have grown chickens who are used to getting treats and you set that down in front of them, they're probably going to gobble it up like they are starving, like it's some sort of treat. So it may not seem at first like you are going to save money, especially when they're going to eat it like that, but eventually they'll get used to it and you should start seeing that change. So once you start fermenting your chicken's feed and their bodies are able to actually start using it and utilizing it a lot better, you're also going to see them poop a lot less. And I've read a lot of reports that talk about their chickens' droppings are even less smelly, which sounds really good to me, right? I mean, I only have chicks, so I don't have a full experience with that, but it does sound really enticing, right? Less droppings, less smell. And then once you start fermenting your chicken's feed, the actual process of fermenting is going to help release more vitamins and nutrients out of that feed. And you're actually going to be giving your chickens a more nutritionally sound diet by soaking those grains and seeds that are in your feed. It's actually going to give them more minerals and vitamins, and then the act of fermenting, if you don't know, actually creates probiotics too. If you're giving your chickens probiotics through their feed, that's also going to give them a better balanced gut, and then that balanced gut is also going to transfer over into their immune system as well, and they're just going to have a much better immune system. It's going to give them a little bit of a boost, just like you or me, if we were taking probiotics, it's going to help in the same way. And especially if you have chicks or chickens who just recently underwent something that could have been stressful, a little bit of probiotics is just going to be a great help for their system in general as well. Okay, so the first method that I'm going to talk about is called back slopping. This is what I've been doing, and it's really similar to taking care of a sourdough starter, if you are familiar with that. Essentially, what you're going to do is put your dry feed into a container, and depending on how big your flock is or how often you want to give that fermented feed is going to dictate how big of a container that you have. I mean, I just have 6 chicks, so I'm using a quart-sized mason jar, but I know a lot of people who have 10 to 15 birds and they use a food-grade 5-gallon bucket, or some people like to just use a half-gallon mason jar. So you just have to keep that in mind. And if you're also just starting out and you're not sure if you want to do this, I would recommend just having a small amount to start with and see if you want to go for it, because you don't want to waste a lot of your feed. So you're going to take your container and you're going to put your dry feed in there. I would not recommend putting more than half the volume that your container can hold, because once you add water, the feed is going to absorb that water and swell up, and then it's also going to start bubbling over a little bit once it ferments, and you definitely want to have enough head space in your container. So because I have just a few birds, for me, I just barely filled it, probably to like the first line in my mason jar, and it swelled up to the next line. So you're going to put your feed in your container, and then you're going to add non-chlorinated water Some people say they use tap water and it's fine. We have reverse osmosis water that I like to use for cooking and fermenting stuff, so that's what I've used in here. If you're not sure, I would just say give it a try with your tap water. And you know, the whole point is to let this be convenient and helpful for you and your chickens. If you have to go out and buy bottled water, you're probably not going to want to do it. So just try it with your tap water. So you have your dry feed and you add enough water to give you about a ½ inch or so liquid buffer above your feed. You're gonna just fill it up like that with your ½ inch buffer. Then you're gonna take a lid and leave it loosely on your jar. Do not tighten it all the way because the act of fermenting is going to cause gases and like bubbles to start forming from your feed, and pressure is going to build up. And if you have tightened your lid all the way, just like if you were making sauerkraut or sourdough, it's gonna, your container can explode. So it's best to just leave it loose. All you want to do is have a lid on there really to keep any dust particles, mold spores, if you have that sort of thing, like just going through the air and settling in this. You don't want it super contaminated. You want to keep it clean, but you still want airflow to be able to get out. And then you're just gonna leave it in anywhere in your home. I just have like a shelf in our laundry room that sits there right now because that's where our chicks are in the house, is in the laundry room. And on that first day, you're gonna want to go back and check in a couple hours after you add water because everything's probably going to absorb that water. And if you lost your buffer, just add a little bit more water in it. And you're gonna let that sit for 2 to 4 days. I will come back and check after day 2 or 3 and then just try to feed it to your chickens and see if they like it. Because the longer you let it sit, the more it's going to ferment and the more sour it's gonna get. And some chickens may not be into that super sour flavor. So 4 days is like the most I would go. And so after you let your feed ferment for a couple days, right? You don't have to go in and stir it. You can, or you can give it like a little swirl. It's not really super necessary unless you want to. You're gonna go and just serve it to your chickens. And for us, because my chicks are so little and they just don't eat that much, what that looks like for us is just putting a little bit of this fermented feed onto like a plastic mason lid and just setting it into their brooder and letting them eat it like that, and then removing it once they're finished. You don't really want to leave it out all day because it'll dry out. I know a lot of chicken owners say that they just feed enough that they know their chickens will eat in about 30 minutes. Some people leave it out for a couple hours. I tend to leave ours out for a couple hours because the chicks are just kind of like snackish, they don't really they're just new. They don't come over and like eat a big meal, you know what I mean? Now, why this method is called back slopping is because after I feed my chicks this fermented feed, I'm going to go back to my dry feed container that's not fermented, and I'm just going to add it a little bit, probably like around the same amount that I took out to feed them. I'm just going to add that dry feed right back into the jar and then mix it in and then set my lid on and leave it loosely on the shelf, and it'll be ready tomorrow. It's very similar to having a sourdough starter, right? So if you have a sourdough starter, you have that fermented flour and water, and then you use what you need and you put some back in and it'll like start the process of fermenting already. So that's why this method is called back slopping, because you're taking that dry feed and just slopping it back in, mixing it in with that fermented feed, and your next batch of feed will be ready for within 24 hours. So then, the next day you feed again and you just add a little more dry feed, you're good to go. You don't have to keep waiting that 4 days. You don't have to start over with a completely new container and add more dry feed or water or anything like that. If you do see that it's getting dry, go ahead and add some water. I mean, it can't hurt. So then the next method is, I just call it like a staggering approach. It's essentially the same method where you would use a container based on your needs, the needs of your flock or how often you want to feed fermented. And most people will start off with like a container that has enough fermented feed to feed for like 2 days. So they'll go through, add their dry feed, add their water, let it ferment for like 2 days. And then on that second day, they'll go and get a second container, do the same thing, add feed and water, and let it start fermenting. So then you have 2 jars that are fermenting. Jar number 1 will be ready, and you can feed out of that. And then by the time jar number 1 is done, your second jar will be ready to feed the next day, and you will have a completely empty jar. You can clean it out and just, start over with a fresh batch of fermented feed, and then you would start a 3rd jar and have it ready. And I guess people maybe they just like that because maybe it feels cleaner. I'm not really sure why someone would take that approach. It just seems like a lot more work for me, but I did see a lot of people say that they like that. They like having multiple containers going. So that's basically in a nutshell, right? So you're just making multiple containers and you're staggering your start times, and then by the time you have emptied that first jar, your next jar is ready, and then by the time you've emptied that one, then your next one is ready, and you're starting with like a whole new ferment every single time. Chickens are so cute, you guys. They're so silly. They just love the dust. It's so funny. I had no idea like chickens were so cute. I always wanted chickens, but I didn't truly understand like how silly and cute they were. So some things that you might want to look for if you're going to ferment your chicken's feed is the growth of mold. If you find anything fuzzy growing on your containers, throw it out. Clean that container, sterilize it, and start your ferment over. Sometimes just contamination, like introduction of other bacteria, that can happen, or you let it sit out and ferment for way too long, and like in a warmer area. So if you see anything like that growing in your ferment, throw it out. It's not good for your birds to eat. Now there is something called calm yeast, and that's more of like a white film. You can see it when you make like sauerkraut and you ferment vegetables. That can happen. It doesn't taste very good. It's safe to eat, but it's not very tasty. So some people say you can just stir it back into your fermented, a bee. So some people say you can just stir that calm yeast back in, and a lot of other people say that they just like to scoop it out, and it's fine. You don't need to throw out your whole ferment. You can just scoop it off the top or stir it in. It's up to you. Some other notes to mention are that if you are storing your ferment in a warmer room, it's going to ferment a lot faster. So go back and check on it around day 2. If you store your ferment in a colder room, it might take a little longer, closer to 3 or 4 days. Your ferment should not smell putrid. It should not smell like alcohol. If it does smell like alcohol, do not feed it to your chickens. Ours has like a bready, fruity taste. The other day when I was feeding the chickens the fermented feed, my daughter was like, "Mom, why does it smell like bread in here?" And it was the fermented feed. It smells bready. When you go and check on your feed after about day 2, you might notice some bubbles at the top. You might notice that you can see a lot of bubbles on the side. Those are good signs. That's just like when you make a sourdough starter or sauerkraut. When you start to see things bubbling around, moving around, that means that your feed is fermenting. So it's a good thing. Don't be worried. You are not brewing alcohol or anything crazy. That's what it's supposed to do. So that's just something to look at. So I think that about covers it. What we use for feed is the organic scratch and peck chick starter. I really like it so far. I mean, I just don't have a lot of experience with chickens. And again, a lot of what I'm sharing with you is just information that I have seen. There are, in fact, scientific studies that talk about these things. And there's a lot of firsthand accounts on websites where people are just sharing, this is my method, this is the differences that I've seen in my chickens. A lot of people even talk about fermenting their feed gives their chickens glossier feathers, heavier eggs more often, thicker shelled eggs, and things like that. You are poking the chicken. So, if you're interested in fermenting feed, I hope this is enough information for you to go ahead and give it a try. I'd love to hear back from you and hear hear what you have to say about it, if your chickens like it, if they were like, what the heck is that? That's how these chicks were at first. They were like, whoa, I do not know what that is. But now they've pretty much got it down. They know, and they go and eat it, and they like it a lot. And if you use a different method to ferment your feed, I'd like to hear about that too. I know everyone kind of has like their own little tweaks on everything, so it's pretty interesting. And if you're still not sure, I really encourage you to go ahead and look into the scientific studies, but also consider reading people's firsthand accounts on why they ferment their chickens' feed and the changes that they've seen in their own chickens from fermenting feed. Always take that into account. Well, thanks for hanging out with me while I talk about fermenting chicken feed, and I hope you guys give it a try. Don't forget to subscribe and see what I've got coming next.